No, he said write it pieces. No. So I'm writing one sentence. Are your essays one sentence? Is that why you can fail your classes? One sentence. No, if you're one sentence, you gotta make sense when you get it. I'm saying, are you writing one sentence for essay? Oh, no.
No.
There's no real number.
Yeah, 7-1.
Yeah, I forgot.
I do not have a Zachary. All right. Are you helping out in the clinic?
Yeah.
All right. So ask them to double check that room number. Okay, here we go. We finished with a Delacroix, right? We did literally leading the people, and we did the Star Trek Charlie X, right? And then we did let's see, we did the Greeks' War of Independence. All right, here we go. Turner, there he is. I think I asked you guys to remind me to write his name down. All right, so did I tell you the story of the Temporary? Okay. So we talked about the ghost ship. All right. Did we talk about trains and locomotives? Ah, all right. I remember now where we left off. All right. All right. I need to change that slide then to story time, and then on top of it, it has that true story stamp.
It says history. It happened like. No, these ones we can verify for sure. We're still verifying. So. What do you mean? The sun is the first thing. I think that's one.
Okay, everybody. So, to tell this next story, I need to explain or need to remind you guys of the Atlantic slave trade. So, this was the plunder of African resources and peoples by the Europeans in order to sell to the colonies of the New World, and also South America, the Caribbean, and North America. When I started getting ready for talking about this sort of stuff in art history, and I kept coming across this slide right here, this map, and it really I think it shocked me the first time I saw it, because I did not so this map shows you kind of like the proportions of people coming from Africa and being sold into slaves into the New World. And you can see the proportions or the thickness of the arrows. And it looks like so many of them went to, or like most of them went to South America, and in the United States consisted of a very small number of, or not, we're talking about giant numbers here, but it was surprising to see that how many went to South America, because when I hear about the slave trade, I always think about the South in America, and I've never really considered what was going on in the rest of the New World. So I wonder what kind of history South America has with slaves, and because it seems to be like spoken a lot in American history. I wonder what South American history, how they treat it. All right, so this is kind of how it works, that African tribes go to war against each other, and the winners take prisoners. They also imprison their criminals. So before the slave trade, criminals were executed. But after the slave trade, the criminals are sold to slave traders. And so the slaves are taken to the coast and sold to European slave traders. Sometimes the Europeans would go on raids for the purposes of capturing slaves, but that was pretty rare because of the fear of contracting malaria. So most of the slave trade came from Africans kidnapping each other and selling their slaves to Europeans. And like I said, before the slave trade, captives, like when they would have war against each other and capture each other, the captives would be executed. But after the slave trade, they are sold to Europeans. All right, and then so the slaves were taken to slave ships. And as the slaves come on board the slave ship, they are looked at by a ship's surgeon. And if the captive showed any signs of illness, he would have been rejected by the doctor. And then at that point, that captive would have no commercial value. And also they were sent back to their African slavers and then killed. And they were often killed right in front of the surgeon. This was called commercial death. The ship's surgeons would have seen hundreds of deaths like this. So a ship coming from Africa into the New World, that would be between a 2 and a 2.5 month voyage. And typically there would be about 350 to 600 slaves per ship. And they were packed very tightly in order to make the most use of space. Remember that these are not seen as people, they were seen as cargo. So just like cargo, you would stack it as tightly as you could so that you can fit the most cargo on one ship, and then that ship would be more profitable because you could put more cargo on it. 12 million slaves were transported between the 16th and the 19th centuries. About 1.2 million to 2.4 million died during transport. They were treated brutally. They were issued poor care. They were packed into tight, unsanitary spaces on ships for months at a time. And measures were taken to stem the onboard mortality rate, such as enforced, quote unquote, dancing as exercise above deck. They were force feeding slaves that were refusing to eat. Some went on hunger strikes to protest their treatment. So they were force fed. The conditions on board also resulted in the spread of fatal diseases and other fatalities like suicides. Slaves who had jumped overboard to escape the horrible treatment. Also, to give you some context, it was normal for ships to lose about 20% of its crew on voyages of this length. In fact, it was beneficial for the captains to lose crew so that when they got paid, they got paid the same amount. There was fewer people to distribute the pay around to. All right, and so here's a model of what a slave ship would have kind of looked like. All right. Oh, I did have it. Like story time with a true story. All right. So this is the story of the Zong massacre. This is the Zong. This was 1781, I believe, and this is the route that the Zong took. I want you to notice this map up here at the top. Let's get my pen right here. All right, that the Zong took this route right here, and it was to go to Jamaica, but they sailed past Jamaica and had to come back. So on August 18, 1781, they sailed from Accra. 442 slaves were on board. There was only room for 193. So already they were extremely overcrowded. They were twice what they were supposed to have on board. This is extremely unusual to carry so many. They began to voyage to Jamaica on September 6th, and they were supposed to stop at Tobago and pick up more drinking water on November 18th, but they did not. So whose fault was that? So at this point, the captain was sick, so he was not able to command. The second in command had been suspended from duty following an argument earlier. And so the third in command was incompetent. So we talked about incompetence with the raft of Medusa. And he had been repeatedly fired from command on boats due to incompetence and drunkenness. So on November 27th, when he saw Jamaica on the horizon, that is the place where they were supposed to stop. He misidentified it as Saint Dominique, and they sailed past Jamaica. They realized their mistake after going 300 miles out of the way, and then they turned around. They only had 4 days of drinking water left, and the trip to get water would have taken 10 days. So at this point of the journey, several crew members had died, and about 62 slaves had died already. So if you only have a limited source of water and you have all these people that you have to get water to, what do? Yeah, you start throwing people overboard. All right, now, before I get to that part, let me talk about insurance on these boats right here. It was a common practice to take out insurance on your cargo, and the insurance covered the boat and the quote-unquote cargo. And in this case, we're talking about the slaves. The people are considered cargo. If the enslaved people died on shore, there would be no insurance. But if they died a natural death at sea, that also there would be no insurance. But if some enslaved people have been thrown overboard to save the rest of the quote unquote cargo or the ship, then they could claim to be made under a general average. So in this case, they could get a recompensation from that insurance. This is a horrible policy. It encourages people to throw slaves overboard. And that's exactly what happened. 54 women and children are thrown through cabin windows into the sea. And then another 42 the next day, 42 male slaves were thrown overboard, and 36 more in the next few days. Another 10, in a display of defiance at the inhumanity of the slavers, chose to commit suicide by jumping into the sea. Having heard the shrieks of the victims as they were thrown into the water, one of the captives requested that the remaining Africans all be denied food and drink rather than being thrown into the sea. And the crew ignored their request. In total, 142 Africans were killed by the time the ship reached Jamaica. All right, the irony or the horrible thing about it's already horrible and it's terrible what was going on. But it rained. During all this time, it rained, and that was, they could collect that water, and it was normal to collect rainwater on these voyages. But still, they threw people overboard as if it hadn't been raining. And then when the ship finally reached Jamaica with 208 slaves on board, so they lost almost half of the number when they left. So the slaves were sold, and the captain died 3 days later from his illness. So they claimed insurance, and the insurance was rejected. And so the boating company went to court against the insurers, and there was other trials and accusations. And so that's the story of the Zong massacre. So this is the painting that is a representation of that Zong massacre. And it is called Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and the Dying, Typhoon Coming On. And then the common name for this painting is called Slave Ship. So it looks, on first glance, it looks like a beautiful painting. We got, the ship in the background. We have a storm coming in from the left, this beautiful sunset, this fiery sky. And in fact, if you look at the upper half of the painting, it looks quite beautiful. But it's when you look at the lower half of the painting is when you see the horror of what is going on. These are the slaves that are drowning in the water. And not only are they drowning, but they're being attacked by like sea monsters or fish. You begin to see these weird things in the water. You see hands coming out of the water, and you see the chains in the water. This leg is in the water, coming out of the water, and is being torn apart by fishes and sea monsters. So it's not enough to drown, but to be eaten while you are drowning is the greatest possible drama, or the worst possible situation. So this painting tells the story of the Zong massacre, and you're looking at the quote unquote cargo that has been cast into the sea. Turner was an abolitionist. That means that politically he stood against slavery, and he voted to have slavery become illegal. That's what abolitionists believed in. So he painted this in 1840, 7 years after England outlawed slave trade and owning slaves. But if England has outlawed slavery, why make this painting? So it's not an issue in England. And this is a message to America, because at this time in 1840, slavery is still going on in America. So there's two messages in this painting. It's man in humanity towards man, and it's also man versus nature, which is a common theme of Romanticism. And notice that there's hardly any outlines. You can just barely make out, the ship in the distance. But this looks a lot like Impressionism. In fact, Turner is seen as foreshadowing Impressionism. Impressionism all had the loose brushstrokes like it's in this painting, and it's absent of almost all details. This painting is about color and value with very little shapes or lines. Just like in his train that was driving through the rain, hardly any lines or details, and the details that were there were very difficult to see. Yes, if we go back, you can see the chain on the foot, and then you can see the chains coming out of the water there. So if you look at other naval pictures at this time that are being made at this time, you can see that Turner is so very different than the others. The others have very sharp outlines. You get very easy to see which parts of the boat, which parts of the sea, and they're a lot more realistic, whereas Turner is a lot more emotional in his. It's like he's painting with emotion instead of painting with his eyes. You can divide this painting into 4 quadrants right here. So in the upper right is very serene and calm and hopeful. It's the only hopeful area of the picture. And it's a nice counterbalance to the violence and the horror that's going on in the lower section of the painting. The upper left is basically a painting of a ship versus the storm. In fact, let me go back to here. A sailor's superstition is that red skies is an omen of a bad storm that's going to come on, and the sunset has set the sea ablaze. And this can also be seen as the judgment of the fires of hell for what the crew has done. Like the crew has been condemned, and it's almost like they're going into hell. Even though a lot of them are not going to die here at, on this voyage, but when they actually do die, they will be going to hell for their treatment of the slaves for the Zong massacre. Very wild brushstrokes, and the ship hurls towards the judgment of the typhoon. The ship is heading into certain death. The storm will consume the ship as well as the slaves. And nature is indifferent. It does not favor good or evil. All right. It's supposed to incite the passions of those looking at the painting. So the storm will consume the ship and the slaves. So, you just can't fight nature. All right, and the ship mast is red. It's like a bloody guilt of what the crew has done. And the ship is going into the storm to be judged. I just talked about that. Very menacing colors and shapes. And Turner was fascinated by the terrifying force of nature, and that definitely shows in this painting. The crew shows no mercy to the captives that they've thrown overboard, and the storm shows no mercy to the ship. All right, so that'll finish us for this portion of chapter 27. Any questions about Turner or, and I think that'll finish us for Romanticism. Any questions about Turner? All right, let me find my other PowerPoint. We're going to look at realism. How are we doing on time? All right, we got, 15 minutes left? All right, so much art history and never enough time to cover it all. So let's go run through the art museum. We were in part 5 of 6 of chapter 27, and we are going to be discussing realism. But before we get to the art, I want to talk about the 19th century Europe. We're going to talk about some things that were going on during this time. I'm going to talk about photography, and I'm going to talk about salons. Are we good to go? All right. So during this time, I've mentioned the Industrial Revolution is going on. So factories are, with the increased technology, factories are able to mass produce objects and to help make other technological wonders, but also products that people buy. And what this has caused is a mass migration from the countryside into the city. So the population migration from the rural to the urban, and this is where the jobs are. The jobs are in the cities. And urban populations are exploding. So on this map, I've got New York and London and Paris identified. These 3 cities are hitting over 1 million people. And that is a major deal. Populations are exploding because of technological advances, but these cities are not growing fast enough to make life comfortable for the people that are living there. Also, trains is a huge deal. Railroads are connecting cities, people between vast distances. That allows people more freedom and mobility to move around. We can move quicker. We can go to more places quicker and cheaper and farther away. So, people are able to, they're able to see family, to make business deals, whereas it would have been more difficult earlier. So all of this creates a demand for coal and iron to skyrocket. And coal and iron are important for everything that is made. It takes coal to burn in the factories to make the machines move, and iron to make the metal parts of these new technologies like trains and the new types of ships and automobiles and more factories. So there's a massive need for coal and iron, which the European nations are getting from their colonies. So I've shown you this map before. This is the British Empire. And you can see this small little country of England up here. Let me get Right up here. Come on. All right. That little small little country of England, and then all these other pink parts are parts of the are colonies of England. And have you ever heard the term "the sun never sets" on the British Empire? And so this is how that is to be: is that wherever the sun is, it's shining on some one of the colonies of England. And the purpose of having all of these colonies is to be in charge of these other places that have the resources and bring those resources back home so that you can build more factories, build more things, have more technology and stuff like that. And a big place that has a lot of these resources is Africa. The map on the left shows the different resources that people are interested in Africa. The map on the right shows the different European nations that that have colonies in Africa. So you can see the pink parts are for England, the red parts are for France, the green parts Germany, and so on. There's only one place in Africa that has no European colonies in it. Can you find it? Yeah, it's Ethiopia. Ethiopia stands independent of the others. All right, we'll talk more about this later. Also, with the Age of Enlightenment, if we put our faith in science, we will progress as a species, as a nation. Things will get better. We'll have cheaper products, and we'll also be able to afford more things. So we'll make more money. Things will get cheaper. We can afford more things. But this also led to the exploitation of the working class and children. So this photograph right here shows a child working in a factory. Factories are very dangerous places. People lose fingers and arms and lose their life in these places. And so it's very inhumane to have children working at these places. And also with the working class, you know, factories can have people working for them for dirt cheap prices. And there's no option for the working class because the only thing that they're trained for is working in factories, and the factories pay them very poorly. Also, we have lots of revolutions. You know, we talked about the French Revolution of 1793. We talked about the French Revolution of 1830, and there was another French Revolution in 1948. But there's also more revolutions elsewhere. But it leads also to a not like the Industrial Revolution is a huge change in Europe as well. New technologies, the telegraph and the telephone help us to have instant communication, and photography lets us take pictures. We have radio is a thing now. You can communicate by radio waves, and electricity is a new thing. Charles Darwin writes a book about the origin of the species. And so the world, scientists begin to believe that the world is older than 6,000 years, which is what the Christians believe at that time. And scientists began questioning the Bible. And there's a twisted logic of Darwin. So this Darwinism leads the European nations to believe that they are the superior species, and they can just go in and especially in the places like Africa and just take the resources there because they are the superior species according to Darwinism. They had the right to these materials, so they take this scientist work into the evolution of the species and they twist it into something that is evil. Also, we have Karl Marx. I want you to write his name down. We'll come back to him later. But his ideas are in line with the ideas of the mid-19th century. The poorer classes are locked out of opportunity to rise in station. And so it takes money to make money. That's how the rich get richer, and the poor never even have a chance of getting rich. So with the Industrial Revolution, if you can afford to build a factory, you can reap all the benefits of that factory. And the poor have no choice but to work in that factory. And the rich can uh, pay slave wages to the people that are working in the factory. So, and Karl Marx says that the only way to make changes, the only way to make your life better is through violent revolution. So Karl Marx says that the proletariat should take charge of the factories by force, then redistribute the wealth of those factories to everybody. But there's a couple of things that Karl Marx got wrong. One is that he misunderstood the nature of value. He overestimated the power of the rich classes, and he underestimated the value of innovation. People could become rich if they had a good idea that was marketable. Another thing that he got wrong is he underestimated that economies had just churned. He underestimated that working class would buy into the system. And he didn't realize that people could make a change with voting. So the unchangeable system wasn't so unchangeable. He saw it as unchangeable, that it could only be changed through violent revolt, but it could be changed. And he saw the world as the oppressed and the oppressors. And this was a major philosophical framework of the 19th century. Karl Marx was the first one to see the world in social order and social classes. And when he wrote about it, like these were new ideas. He was not well known in his lifetime, but his ideas were the concerns at the time. So we have this huge break between the rich and the poor. And realism is the first movement to actually deal with these issues. And how do we rectify the sharp divide between the slaves and the haves and the have-nots? All right, we are going to stop there for today. On tomorrow, when I come back, we're going to talk about photography.